Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring a pretty heavy topic, false accusations and deceit in relationships, from a biblical perspective.
Oh, yeah.
So think about, relationships where trust is completely shattered by lies. That just goes so much against how the Bible describes love.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a tough subject and one that's unfortunately still really relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, we see it. We see it everywhere.
Yeah.
So to approach this biblically, where do we even start?
Well, I think a good place to start would be the ninth commandment.
Okay.
You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. It's Exodus 20.1 Seth.
Right.
And might seem pretty simple on the surface, but it gets really interesting when you start to, dig a little deeper.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess the question then is any lie or, like a little white lie, is that bearing false witness?
Right, yeah. So the source material really emphasizes that it's not about, like, everyday fibs. It's about deliberately distorting the truth with the goal of actually harming someone.
Okay. So there has to be intent
Yeah.
to actually harm someone.
And it goes beyond just the act of lying. It's about the intention. It's about the motivation behind it.
So the why
Yeah.
more than the what.
Absolutely. The source material asks, is the motivation behind this lie rooted in insecurity, malice, a desire to manipulate?
Uh-huh.
And that context is crucial, when we're trying to understand the true nature of bearing false witness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that. It's almost like, the difference between accidentally bumping into someone
Right.
or intentionally shoving them.
Yeah, totally.
Right. It's the impact. The impact is so different.
Totally. And speaking of impact, think about how this all plays out in today's world. Things that we post online, things we share online have the potential to go viral so quickly and reach way beyond just our immediate circle. And it's kind of like a digital version of bearing false witness almost, where, a single unfounded rumor can completely devastate someone's reputation.
Wow. I never thought about it like that before. It's true. Like, it really makes you think about how much weight our words carry,
Yeah.
whether spoken or typed. It's true.
Yeah. And, the Bible gives us some really powerful examples of this, even within, the context of romantic relationships. And one that comes to mind is the story of Potiphar's wife and Joseph
Okay.
in Genesis 39. And basically, she tries to seduce Joseph, and when he rejects her advances, she accuses him of assault.
Oh, wow. That's like the classic woman scorned trope
Yeah.
that you see in movies, TV shows,
Right.
all the time.
It's amazing how these patterns of deceit, repeat throughout history.
Right.
But what's so fascinating about this story is how it highlights, societal power dynamics that can play into these false accusations.
Oh,
You have Potiphar's wife. She's a woman of status.
Uh-huh.
She's using that position to manipulate the situation and protect herself.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that adds a whole other layer to the story. It's
Right.
not just a personal betrayal.
Right.
It's like an abuse of power, and the way society enables that kind of behavior.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that, the Bible, while it was written in a specific historical context,
Yeah.
the principles that it addresses are timeless. They
Yeah.
still resonate today.
That's so true. Even though it happened thousands of years ago, we could still learn from it
Yeah.
and apply these lessons to our own lives. What other examples come to mind?
Well, the Bible doesn't shy away from, showing these destructive consequences of deceit.
Right.
And we see it with Delilah and Samson in Judges 16. Delilah, driven by greed and manipulation, betrays Samson's trust and ultimately brings about his downfall.
It's interesting, though, both of these examples involve women as the accusers.
Right.
I mean, do you think the Bible is trying to say something specific about women and deception?
That's a really great question. It's one that scholars have debated for centuries, really.
Wow.
Some interpretations focus on the historical and cultural context,
Correct.
suggesting that, these stories reflect the societal norms of the time. Others argue that these are just examples of, human sinfulness, regardless of gender, can manifest in destructive ways.
So it's not about gender.
Right.
It's about the danger of deceit.
Right. These stories aren't meant to be prescriptive,
Right.
or to say that all women or all men are prone to deceit.
Right.
They're cautionary tales that show us the potential consequences of choosing lies over truth.
Mhm.
and that devastating impact that it can have on individuals and relationships.
Yeah, and those consequences, I mean, they aren't always immediate, right?
Right.
Sometimes the ripple effect of a lie can continue for years,
Yeah,
impact generations.
absolutely. Take the story of Jezebel and Naboth in 1 Kings 21. Jezebel, driven by a lust for power and possessions, orchestrates Naboth's death through false accusations, and all to acquire his vineyard.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One lie leads to another, and then ultimately innocent people get hurt.
Yeah.
And it's not just the Old Testament.
Right.
The New Testament shows that, even Jesus, perfect and sinless, was subject to false accusations.
Absolutely. In Matthew 26.59 to 61, we see, these religious leaders deliberately fabricating these charges against Jesus,
Wow.
ultimately leading to his crucifixion.
Yeah.
And this really emphasizes that anyone,
Right.
regardless of their righteousness, can be a target of deceit and false accusations.
Wow, that's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder, if someone like Jesus can be targeted with lies, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Right. And that's where things get really interesting, because even though the Bible highlights how prevalent deceit is and these devastating consequences, it also offers this glimmer of hope.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all.
There's a way out of this darkness.
There is. And it starts with understanding that a relationship that is built on lies and manipulation fundamentally contradicts the biblical concept of love.
Okay.
The Bible is very clear that love rejoices in the truth. That's 1 Corinthians 13.6. So how do we reconcile that ideal with the reality of living with someone who's constantly undermining trust with these false accusations?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, it almost feels like a catch-22.
Right.
On the one hand, you're supposed to work things out.
Right.
But on the other, how can you build a healthy relationship on a foundation of lies?
Yeah, that's where things get really nuanced, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've established that a relationship built on lies contradicts how the Bible defines love. But at the same time, the Bible places such a high value on, marriage and commitment.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two things when deceit is kind of at the root of a relationship?
Yeah, it's a tension that I think a lot of people grapple with, and the source material, it offers some guidance. It suggests that while reconciliation and forgiveness are always the goal, sometimes separation is necessary for the well-being of the person who is being falsely accused.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a really tough decision to make, especially when you think about the vow, for better or for worse,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
How do you determine when separation is justified versus, kind of persevering through the tough times?
It's definitely not black and white. The source material, it points to 1 Corinthians 7.15, where Paul talks about God calling us to peace.
So is prioritizing peace, sometimes above staying in a potentially harmful situation? Like, is that a valid interpretation of that verse? It seems to go against that traditional view of marriage as unbreakable.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, but it's important to remember, we're not just talking about physical harm. The source material really emphasizes the damage that's being done to the soul when you're constantly subjected to deceit and mistrust.
Yeah, it's like being in a constant state of emotional whiplash. You never know what's real, what's not.
Right.
It just seems like it would be impossible to experience the kind of love and intimacy that God intends for us to have in relationships.
Yeah. And while divorce is generally discouraged in the Bible, it's not a blanket prohibition.
Yeah.
Matthew 5.32 lists adultery as grounds for divorce, but the source material argues that the broader principle is about a violation of the marriage covenant.
So could emotional abuse and systematic deceit, could those be seen as forms of betrayal that also violate that covenant, even if there's no physical infidelity?
That's the argument. And it raises an interesting question. Is it more faithful to stay in a relationship that's causing harm? Or is it sometimes an act of obedience to God to actually remove yourself from a situation that's hindering your spiritual and emotional well-being?
It's like choosing to honor the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
More so than just the letter of the law.
Right.
But I could imagine for some people, even under those circumstances, leaving a marriage, it could feel like a failure.
Absolutely. And the source material acknowledges that, The decision to stay or leave is deeply personal and should never be framed as a failure of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that there is no one-size-fits-all answer. and that ultimately, we need to seek God's guidance for our own individual situations.
Yeah. I mean, it takes the pressure off of trying to find some external rule book,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
and instead it encourages us to have, an honest conversation with God about what's truly best for us.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And remember, even if a relationship doesn't survive, there's still hope for healing and restoration for both individuals.
Okay, so where do we where do we find that hope? We've talked a lot about the negative side of things,
Yeah.
the deceit, the accusations, the potential damage to relationships. But what about the positive? What does the source material say about finding healing and restoration?
Well, that's the beauty of God's grace. Even in the midst of all the heartbreak and the betrayal, he offers us this path toward wholeness. Psalm 37.6 reassures us that he will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday.
It's like when the sun breaks through the clouds after a storm, It's
Right.
that reminder that even when the lies seem overwhelming, the truth will eventually come out.
And that's not just for the person who's been falsely accused. The source material also talks about the possibility of redemption for the accuser as well.
So there's hope on both sides.
Yeah.
Even for the person who's been caught up in a pattern of deceit and manipulation.
Absolutely, but it requires repentance.
Yeah,
A genuine acknowledgement of the wrong that has been done and a willingness to make amends.
makes sense. I mean, for trust to be rebuilt, there has to be that sincere change of heart
Yeah.
and that commitment to living differently. It can't just be swept under the rug.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of your actions
Yeah.
and making that conscious choice to break free from those destructive patterns. And it's not an easy process, but the Bible shows us time and time again that transformation is possible through God's power.
So for the person listening right now, maybe they're feeling lost and hurt. What's the takeaway message for them? Where can they find support and guidance as they navigate this really painful situation?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say that you're not alone. These situations are more common than you might think, and there's no shame in seeking help and support.
It's like we were talking about before. I mean, the Bible is full of stories about, people who have faced deceit and betrayal. It's a human problem. It's not a personal failing.
Absolutely. And whether it's through, counseling support groups or even just talking to a trusted friend or mentor, there are people who can offer guidance and support. Don't be afraid to reach out and find that safe space where you can process what you're going through and start to heal.
And what about like the practical side of things? Like what if someone's in a relationship where those accusations are ongoing, and they just don't feel safe?
That's a really tough situation. And it's important to remember that you have the right to protect yourself. Sometimes creating physical and emotional distance is necessary to regain a sense of safety and clarity.
So sometimes self-preservation has to come first.
Yeah, sometimes separating from the situation, even temporarily, is necessary just to protect your own well-being. And that's not a sign of weakness. It's not a failure of faith. It's an act of self-care and a recognition that you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity.
It's about setting those healthy boundaries,
Yeah.
honoring the truth, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And remember, even if the relationship doesn't survive, there's still hope for healing and restoration for both people. God's grace is big enough to cover even the most painful situations. And he can use those experiences to bring about growth and transformation.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the midst of heartbreak and betrayal, there's always the possibility of a new beginning.
Absolutely. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to hold on to that hope. Even when things feel dark and hopeless, there's always light at the end of the tunnel.
Light at the end of the tunnel. I like that image. It makes me think about how this whole conversation about truth and deception, it applies to so much more than just romantic relationships.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
These principles, they have ripple effects in every area of our lives: friendships, families, workplaces, even how we interact within our communities.
It's like that saying, character's who you are when no one's watching,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If we're willing to compromise the truth in one area, those cracks can, they can spread to other areas.
Yeah, that's a great point. It makes me think about how we often fall into patterns of unintentional deceit, even in ways that seem harmless.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever found yourself maybe exaggerating a story to make it more entertaining, or gossiping about someone without really knowing all the facts?
Oh, totally. I think we've all been there at some point.
Yeah.
It's easy to justify those little white lies.
Yeah.
Or those moments where we bend the truth a bit. But you're right. Those seemingly small choices, they can have a cumulative effect on our character and our relationships.
Exactly. And it's not just about what we say, but how we say it too, right?
Yeah.
Our tone of voice, our body language, even the way we frame a story can contribute to a distorted perception of the truth.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible filters,
Yeah.
that shape how we see the world. And sometimes those filters get pretty cloudy, especially when we let our own biases and assumptions kind of take over.
Yeah. That's why it's so important to cultivate that spirit of self-awareness,
Yeah.
and to be really intentional about checking our own motivations. Are we speaking from a place of love and truth? Or are we letting our insecurities or fears or even our desire to be right kind of get in the way?
It's like we need to be constantly holding a mirror up to ourselves, asking those tough questions.
Oh, yeah.
Am I being honest with myself, with others? Am I representing the truth as accurately as I can?
Yeah, and those questions, they're not always easy to answer, but the more we practice that self-reflection, the more we'll be able to spot those subtle ways in which we might be twisting the truth, even unintentionally.
So what are some practical steps, that we can take to become more mindful of our words and our actions? How do we break those habits of unintentional deceit?
Well, one thing that's really helped me is to practice active listening. Instead of jumping to conclusions or interrupting with my own perspective, I try to really focus on what the other person is saying. And I ask clarifying questions to make sure I understand their point of view.
That's so important. It's like we're so quick to judge, and offer our own opinion that we forget to actually listen,
Yeah.
And to seek to understand.
And it's also helpful to pause before we speak, especially when we're feeling, really emotional or reactive. Sometimes that extra moment of reflection can prevent us from saying something that we might regret later.
It's like hitting the pause button on our words before we hit the send button on our mouth,
Yeah,
And sometimes that pause, it might even reveal that it's better to say nothing at all.
exactly. There's wisdom in silence,
Mhm.
especially when we haven't had the chance to really process our own thoughts and feelings.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the devastating consequences of deceit to the possibility of redemption and healing. But I think the most important takeaway is this. Truth matters. It matters in our personal relationships. It matters in our communities. And it matters in our relationship with God.
And pursuing the truth, it isn't always easy. It requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to be uncomfortable at times. But ultimately, it's the path towards, freedom, wholeness, and lasting peace.
But as you go about your day-to-day, I encourage you to reflect on what we've talked about. Ask yourself, where might I be tempted to compromise the truth, even in small ways? How can I be a better steward of my words and my actions, and how can I promote a culture of honesty and integrity in my own relationships and communities?
Those are powerful questions.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners will take the time to really wrestle with them. Because in the end, the quality of our lives, it's directly related to the quality of our relationships. And those relationships, they're built on a foundation of trust, respect, and a shared commitment to truth.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has been insightful and encouraging. And remember, you're not alone on this journey.